Somewhere in a Microsoft data center right now, there is a server quietly running Linux, and it has been running Linux for years. And the company that built that server is the same company whose CEO once stood in front of a journalist and called Linux a cancer. And I want you to sit with that word for a second, because he didn't say a threat. He didn't say a competitor. He said cancer, an intellectual property cancer that attaches itself to everything it touches. And now in the summer of 2026, that exact same company has just shipped its own Linux distribution, built it from scratch, put its own name on it, and is quietly asking millions of developers to build their careers on top of it. And the question I'm going to answer in the next few minutes isn't whether this is a good product, because by every technical measure it actually is. The question is why a company spends 25 years walking from cancer to co-author, and whether that walk was a genuine change of heart or the slowest, most patient. Corporate maneuver. The software industry has ever watched unfold in real time because there is a document, a real one, buried for years and then leaked on Halloween night by an accident of history that reads less like ancient gossip and more like a blueprint someone forgot to burn. And once you've read it, you will never look at a keynote slide the same way again. So let's start with a number, because numbers don't lie even when marketing decks do. And this number should stop you cold. More than 2 out of every 3 computing cores running on Microsoft's own Azure cloud right now are not running Windows, they're running Linux. Microsoft said this out loud themselves at the Open Source Summit North America in Minneapolis on May 18th of this year, standing on stage and admitting that the infrastructure quietly holding up Microsoft 365, GitHub, and even OpenAI's ChatGPT is Linux underneath all the way down. So think about what that actually means for a second. The engine generating the cash that is currently propping up Microsoft's entire stock price is running on the operating system Microsoft spent a decade trying to bury. Every time you swipe a card for an Azure subscription, there's a real statistical chance the machine processing that transaction is running Linux, and not a single line of Windows code. Microsoft has effectively been a Linux company hiding inside a Windows company for years. They just never said the quiet part out loud until this year. And then, in Minneapolis, they did. And alongside that confession came something bigger. Azure Linux 4.0, not a stripped-down container tool hidden in the back of some Kubernetes cluster where nobody would notice, but a full general-purpose Linux operating system, built from a Fedora 43 snapshot, using the exact same DNF5 package manager that Fedora and Red Hat themselves rely on, with every single deviation from the open source upstream documented publicly on GitHub for any engineer on Earth to inspect. And standing right beside it, Azure Container Linux, now fully generally available, an immutable, read-only container host built on the Flatcar project, engineered specifically to sit underneath massive AI training clusters, the kind where a single compromised package spread across 10,000 machines could be an absolute catastrophe. And when this pairing rolled out further at Microsoft's Build conference on June 2nd, something shifted that had never shifted before in the company's 40-year history. Microsoft stopped being a guest at somebody else's open source party and became a landlord with its own building, its own name on the lease. And to understand why that should make your stomach tighten just slightly, you have to go back, all the way back, to a man almost nobody outside the industry has ever heard of, a Microsoft program manager, named Vinod Valopalil, and one memo he wrote in August of 1998, a memo marked Microsoft Confidential, written for 2 of the company's most powerful executives, Jim Alchin and Paul Maritz, titled, "With the kind of bland corporate language that hides the most dangerous ideas, open source software, a new development methodology," and it was never supposed to leave the building. But 2 months later, somebody leaked it to a well-known figure in the open source world named Eric Raymond, who published it on his website on October 31st, Halloween night, and it has been called the Halloween document ever since. And what was inside it was not dismissive. It was not a company laughing off a toy operating system built by hobbyists. It was fear, real, documented, executive-level fear, because Valopilil was warning Microsoft's leadership that open source represented the first software development model in history with the raw potential to genuinely threaten Microsoft's entire intellectual property-based business. And he was right. History would go on to prove him exactly right. And inside that memo, he laid out 3 possible strategies for neutralizing that threat, and the third one was given an internal name that would go on to become one of the most infamous phrases in the history of the technology industry. Embrace, extend, extinguish. 3 words, and the mechanics behind them were almost insultingly simple and brutally effective. First, you embrace the open technology. You support it publicly. You join its community, you smile for the cameras and build genuine goodwill and trust with the people who built the thing you're circling. Second, you extend it. You build your own version, layered with extra proprietary features that only work properly inside your own walls. features just good enough that people start to prefer your version without quite realizing what they've traded away to get it. And third, you extinguish. Once enough developers and companies have quietly standardized around your extended version, the original open version starts falling behind. Its community fragments, and your version becomes the default nobody even remembers choosing. And this wasn't rumor. This wasn't speculation from bitter open source advocates with an axe to grind. This was internal Microsoft strategy, written by a Microsoft employee, later authenticated by Microsoft itself, and eventually entered as evidence in a federal antitrust case. And here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. Microsoft had already run this exact playbook once before. Years earlier, against a company most people under 30 have never even heard of, a company called Netscape. And what happened to it is precisely why this new Azure Linux announcement deserves a far more careful look than the celebratory headlines are currently giving it, because Netscape built the web browser that introduced most of the world to the internet in the first place. And by the mid-1990s, it was the dominant way people got online, and Microsoft looked at that dominance and decided correctly that it was an existential threat to Windows itself. So Microsoft ran the play, embraced the idea of the web browser by building Internet Explorer, extend it with Windows-only features, and deep operating system integration that made it behave better on Windows than any competing browser ever possibly could, and then Extinguish, bundling it directly into Windows for free until Netscape simply could not survive in the market anymore. And within about 5 years, Netscape was gone, sold off in pieces, its once dominant browser reduced to a footnote maintained by volunteers, and the United States Department of Justice took Microsoft to court over exactly this pattern of behavior. And a federal judge ruled that Microsoft had illegally maintained its monopoly through anti-competitive conduct. Microsoft lost that case, and it is worth sitting with the uncomfortable fact that the very same period when Linux started growing into a real threat, the man who wrote the Halloween memo was still sitting inside Microsoft's walls, watching and writing. So fast forward now, past the antitrust settlement, past years of quiet corporate repositioning, to the year that actually starts changing this story, 2014, the year Satya Nadella became Microsoft's CEO, and almost immediately he said 3 words that nobody inside that building had ever said publicly before. Microsoft loves Linux, and the signal underneath those 3 words was unmistakable. The old combative Microsoft, the one that called its rival a cancer, was being quietly retired, and the new one was going to position itself as a partner to the open source world instead of an adversary trying to bury it. And in 2016, Microsoft joined the Linux Foundation as a platinum member, paying roughly $500,000 a year for a permanent seat on the very board that governs the Linux trademark and helps fund the engineers who maintain the Linux kernel itself. That same year, Microsoft shipped the Windows subsystem for Linux, bringing a genuine Linux environment directly inside Windows for developers for the first time in the company's entire history. And then, in 2018, came the acquisition that most casual observers still radically underestimate the significance of. Microsoft bought GitHub for $7.5 billion in stock, and GitHub is not just a convenient website for storing code. GitHub is functionally the front door of the entire open source world, the place where the overwhelming majority of the planet's software gets written, reviewed, argued over, and published, hosting more than 518 million public and open source projects with over 1 billion individual contributions logged in a single year alone. And when Microsoft bought that, it didn't just acquire a tool, it acquired the infrastructure, sitting underneath nearly every open source project on the planet, including Linux itself, and notably the Linux Foundation's own leadership publicly praised the deal at the time. The community largely celebrated. The old enemy appeared to have genuinely become a patron. And by 2019, Linux was already running more machines on Azure than Windows was, meaning Microsoft had quietly become one of the largest commercial operators of Linux infrastructure on the entire planet, years before most of its own customers ever realized it. And then this year, the final and most public step arrived. And it's worth being fair here because Microsoft has also pushed real engineering contributions upstream into Fedora and the Linux kernel itself through this project. Kernel improvements tuned for Azure's own hardware accelerators, network drivers built for high bandwidth interconnects, flowing back to benefit the broader open source community using those same components. And that part is genuinely real, genuinely valuable, and genuinely worth crediting. But now consider the quiet consequence. Sitting underneath all that generosity, any engineering team that standardizes its production infrastructure on Azure Linux is now running an operating system built by Microsoft, tuned specifically for Microsoft's cloud, tested primarily against Microsoft's own infrastructure, and increasingly difficult to walk away from without months of costly reengineering. And the deeper an organization goes into it, the harder it becomes to simply pack up and move to a competing cloud provider. And that's not a conspiracy theory. That's just how deeply integrated vendor-specific infrastructure has always worked, going back decades, regardless of which company happens to be selling it. And it doesn't stop at the server room either. Because if you're one of the hundreds of millions of people still running Windows on your own personal laptop right now, this story reaches directly into your machine too. At Build 2026, Microsoft announced it is bringing more than 75 native Linux command line tools directly into Windows itself, based on an open source project called utils, a full ground-up rewrite of the classic Unix toolset written in the Rust programming language. The same fundamental utilities that have quietly run on nearly every serious server on the planet for roughly 30 years, and Microsoft is now folding them directly into the core of Windows, piece by piece, building the Linux experience straight into the operating system it once said Linux existed to destroy. And when you lay the pattern out, plainly like that, it becomes almost impossible to unsee, embrace. Microsoft loves Linux, joins the foundation, buys GitHub, extend. Microsoft builds its own Linux distribution, its own immutable container host, its own command line layer baked directly into Windows. Every single piece of it optimized to work best inside Microsoft's own ecosystem. And the third step in that original 1998 strategy was Extinguish. And to be fair, nobody serious is claiming we've arrived there. And there's a real, credible argument that we may never actually get there at all. But before we weigh that argument honestly on both sides, there's one more piece of the story you need to hear. Because it's not about corporate strategy documents or antitrust rulings. It's about what it actually feels like to build an entire career around trusting a company and then watching that company quietly change direction underneath you. In 2020, Microsoft's president Brad Smith stood up publicly and admitted, on the record, that Microsoft had been on the wrong side of history when open source exploded across the industry. Not a quiet internal memo, not a carefully hedged blog post, an actual public admission from one of the most powerful executives and one of the most powerful companies on earth. And back when Microsoft was executing the strategy Valapillo described in that 1998 memo, real IT managers at real companies were making real career-defining infrastructure decisions based entirely on what Microsoft was telling them publicly. They heard their own CEO, Steve Ballmer, tell the Chicago Sun-Times on June 1st of 2001 on the record that Linux was a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. And some of them listened. They chose Windows Server over Linux alternatives because Microsoft told them repeatedly and confidently that Linux was legally risky, intellectually contaminated, and unsuitable for serious professional deployment. They built entire technology stacks, and in many cases, entire careers, around the assumption that Microsoft's ecosystem was the safe, defensible, professional choice, and that choosing differently would have been reckless. And then slowly, the ground shifted underneath every single one of those decisions. Azure became a Linux majority cloud. Windows became a smaller and smaller share of Microsoft's overall revenue with each passing year. And the Windows-centered world those managers had staked their professional judgment on started looking less like the safe choice and more like the exact path Microsoft itself was quietly walking away from. And now, in 2026, the same company that told an entire generation of technology decision makers that Linux was dangerous is asking those same decision makers, or their successors, to standardize their infrastructure on Microsoft's own version of Linux instead. So here's the honest question sitting underneath all of it. When a company with this specific, well-documented history asks you to trust its version of something that used to be free, open, and owned by nobody, what exactly are you supposed to do with that? And there are genuinely two different futures that are both fully consistent with everything. We've just walked through, and it's worth laying out both of them fairly, because exaggerating either one does you no favors. In the first future, Microsoft's transformation is completely genuine. Nadella inherited a company in 2014 that had spent roughly a decade losing fights it should never have picked. Against Linux, against the open web, against a development model it fundamentally misunderstood the strength of. He looked at where the entire cloud computing industry had actually gone, an industry built overwhelmingly on open standards and running Linux virtually everywhere, and concluded that Microsoft's long-term survival depended on becoming a genuine part of that ecosystem, instead of continuing to fight it from the outside. Under that reading the GitHub acquisition, the Linux Foundation board seat, Azure Linux 4.0, all of it represents a company that recognized it was already too late to extinguish anything meaningful, and chose instead to compete by becoming genuinely useful to the community it once tried to bury. And in this version of events, a developer choosing Azure Linux today gets a well-maintained, security-hardened, transparently documented distribution, openly published on GitHub, backed by one of the largest engineering organizations on the planet, with real verifiable contributions flowing back upstream into Fedora and the Linux kernel itself. And that case is not speculation. The commits are public, the contributions are real. You can go verify every part of it yourself today. But in the second future, The Halloween memo isn't a dusty historical artifact. It's a roadmap that never got fully executed on its original target, only interrupted because the antitrust case against Netscape-era Microsoft forced a retreat on that specific battlefield before the third step could ever be completed. And in this reading, the GitHub acquisition was step one of a much longer control layer being quietly assembled. Azure Linux is step 2. The 75 Linux command line tools folded directly into Windows are part of a longer arc pointed toward a future where the version of Linux that most developers actually use, trust, and build their careers around is a version that Microsoft maintains, Microsoft hosts, and Microsoft can subtly steer over time, not through force, not through another antitrust triggering bundling scandal, but through convenience, through being the easiest, best documented, most frictionless path available at every single decision point along the way. And in that future, the Extinguish step doesn't look like killing Linux outright because that would be both impossible and legally catastrophic in 2026. It looks like something quieter and arguably more effective, owning the specific version of Linux that ends up mattering most. And the honest, unglamorous answer sitting between these two futures is that both of them can be true at exactly the same time. And that's precisely what makes this story genuinely difficult rather than a simple hero or villain narrative. Microsoft says it loves Linux and has said so consistently for well over a decade now, and the evidence backing that claim up is real, documented, and independently verifiable through public commit histories and upstream contributions. But the Halloween documents are also real. The Netscape precedent is also real. Brad Smith's own admission that Microsoft was on the wrong side of history is also real, and the underlying pattern, embrace, extend, and then a long patient pause, exactly where the third step used to sit, is genuinely visible if you choose to look directly at it instead of only reading the celebratory press coverage. And whether that third step ever actually arrives depends entirely on one thing: whether Microsoft's business incentives continue to align naturally with a healthy, independent open source ecosystem, or whether a future moment arrives where quietly controlling the dominant version of Linux becomes worth more to Microsoft's bottom line than preserving the goodwill of the community that built the technology. It now depends on for the majority of its own cloud revenue. And history's oldest and most reliable rule about corporations applies here with unusual precision. Watch what a company actually does over time, not what it says in a keynote. And right now, the middle of 2026, what Microsoft is actually doing is quietly, methodically building the exact infrastructure that would make a third step possible, whether or not it ever intends to take it. So let's ground all of this in the specifics of exactly where things stand as of this month, because the details matter more than the broad narrative alone. Azure Linux 4.0 entered public preview at Build on June 2nd, built from a Fedora 43 snapshot, running the Linux 6.6 LTS kernel, shipping with a base image roughly half the size of a comparable Ubuntu or Arch Linux install, and already quietly powering more than 100,000 virtual machines before most. Customers even knew the product had a public name. General availability is expected later this year to line up with the next long-term servicing cycle, and Windows subsystem for Linux integration is planned to follow shortly after preview, meaning Windows developers will soon be able to run locally on their own laptops, the exact same operating system their production workloads run on inside Azure. And that detail matters more than it sounds like on the surface, because closing that gap between what runs on your laptop and what runs in production is exactly the kind of convenience that quietly deepens platform lock-in without anyone ever feeling like they were locked into anything at all. And it's worth noting in fairness that Azure Linux 4.0 isn't some closed proprietary black box either. Every deviation from its Fedora upstream is documented publicly on GitHub. The package manager was switched to DNF5, the same one Fedora and Red Hat themselves use, and independent engineers examining the release have confirmed the transparency is genuine, even while cautioning that Fedora-based should never be mistaken for Fedora-compatible, since the minimal package footprint means teams actually need to test their own dependency chains rather than assume a smooth drop-in migration. And there's also a limitation worth being upfront about, because a fully honest account of this story has to include the parts that complicate the tidy narrative in either direction. FIPS 143 certification, the security standard that governments, financial institutions, and healthcare organizations often legally require, is still in progress and won't be available until general availability later this year, meaning Azure Linux 4.0 currently isn't a drop-in replacement for certified RHEL builds in regulated industries just yet, though Microsoft says it expects to close that specific gap before general availability. And Microsoft has been explicit that while Azure Linux can technically run outside of Azure, it isn't officially supported on other clouds, on-premises data centers, or physical hardware, a real and meaningful contrast with genuinely platform-neutral distributions like Ubuntu Server or Fedora Server, which are engineered from the ground up to run anywhere without playing favorites. And that distinction alone tells you something important about the actual purpose behind this release. This was never built to be a gift to the broader Linux ecosystem the way Ubuntu or Debian are. It was built to be the best possible operating system for running workloads specifically inside Microsoft's own cloud, one that just happens to also be released under an open source license. And this isn't a theoretical migration risk sitting somewhere in the future either. It's already happened at real scale with real companies. LinkedIn, which Microsoft also owns, has already migrated its entire infrastructure onto Azure. Linux 3, the previous generation of the same distribution, Databricks moved more than 100,000 virtual machines and over 1 million CPU cores onto it with zero customer-facing incidents during the entire transition. These aren't small pilot programs run by a handful of curious engineers experimenting on the side. These are foundational, company-wide infrastructure decisions made by major organizations that concluded Microsoft's own Linux was reliable enough and convenient enough to build their entire technical future on top of. And Jim Zemlin, the CEO of the Linux Foundation itself, addressed the historical irony of all of this directly at the Minneapolis summit, pointing out that when Microsoft first joined the Linux Foundation years ago, there was genuine, widespread, conspiracy theory level suspicion in the community about the company's true motives. And that suspicion, it turns out, wasn't entirely paranoid. It just took a decade longer than anyone expected to see exactly where it was heading. And the destination that's emerging isn't quite domination in the old aggressive Ballmer-era sense. It's something subtler, quiet, deeply convenient, well-documented, genuinely useful infrastructure that also happens to make Microsoft's cloud platform increasingly difficult to ever fully leave. And so, where does that actually leave you? If you're a developer, an IT decision maker, or simply someone who has watched this industry long enough to remember when Microsoft and open source were treated as contradictory terms inside the very same sentence, the honest answer isn't a dramatic warning to avoid Azure Linux entirely, because that would be an overreaction. The evidence doesn't fully support. It's a well-built, genuinely open, actively maintained distribution with real engineering credibility behind it, and dismissing it outright because of what happened to Netscape 25 years ago would be its own kind of intellectual laziness. But the honest answer also isn't blind enthusiasm either, because the goodwill Microsoft has spent the last decade carefully building shouldn't erase the memory of exactly what the company documented about its own intentions, back when it thought nobody outside the building would ever read those words, and the healthiest approach, the one open source itself was actually designed to make possible in the first place, is the same one experienced engineers have quietly applied to every vendor claim for decades. Trust, but verify. Read the commits, track the upstream contributions, watch the licensing terms over time, and not just at launch. Pay close attention to whether Microsoft's Linux stays genuinely portable, or whether 3 or 4 years from now the convenience gently tightens into something that looks a lot more like dependency. And here's the question I genuinely want to hear your answer to. Is a company capable of documenting its own predatory playbook in writing back in 1998? And then spending the next quarter century slowly, deliberately, convincingly rewriting its own character? Or does history simply not work that way for companies of this size, no matter how many kernel commits get pushed upstream along the way? Tell me honestly which side of that argument you land on, because this debate is nowhere near settled inside the industry itself. And if this walkthrough connected pieces of the story you'd never seen laid out together before, stay close, because the next one goes even deeper, and share this with the one developer in your life who's currently being told to standardize their entire infrastructure on Azure Linux without ever having heard the word Halloween attached to Microsoft's history.